Hey, welcome to week 3 of Adolescence, Sexuality, and Parenting. Uh, I'm glad you're watching another one. Quick apology and correction. This is week 3. I previously said this was a 3-week series. I was wrong. There's 4 weeks. This week we're talking about biblical sex. Next week will be the last one. It's called the talk. It's how do you engage your kids with all of this information they're learning and that you're learning. There's an extra week of you having to sit and watch me talk for a while. So I'm sorry, but I don't know. You can figure it out. This one will be a little bit shorter. So that's my promise to you. We'll see how it goes. This week we're talking all about biblical sex. In the high school group, we just had our chat on this last night as of the recording of this video, and it went really well. They handled it very well, had really good questions. They seemed to have taken a lot away from it and learned a lot of things they didn't know before, that's the hope. And of course, there were plenty of giggles as well because we have 3 freshman boys, so that's a guarantee, right? But it was a lot of, well, I will say fun. It was fun, but it was also a little uncomfortable for all of us, but that's okay because as we talked about it, it's worth talking about. But I hope that they had good things to say about it if you were able to get anything from them about it. So, as we begin this talk, I just want to ask you a question. How are you feeling about all of this? Are you feeling encouraged? Does this information discourage you? Is it overwhelming? I'd be very interested in whatever feedback you have. So, as you're watching this, as you kind of wrestle with these things, I'd love for you to shoot me a text or an email just letting me know kind of how you're doing with this learning stuff. And thank you to those that have reached out and given me feedback. That's really appreciated. And I just also want to clarify one thing too. Maybe some of the other talks make it feel like oh man, these are deep waters we're swimming in, which they are. I also want to affirm our group of students that we have. We have just an amazing batch of kids. And the cool thing is it's not just the kids, it's also you as parents. I'm very fortunate as a youth pastor to have such a awesome group that we have to talk about and navigate these things, but I also don't have big concerns about anyone. I know they have different struggles and things they're working on and walking through, but we also have just a really, really great group of kids. So I just want to affirm your children and affirm you as parents that all the youth leaders, are just so lucky, and we love hanging out with your kids so much. And so I just wanted to say that in case it came across that things are that it's not that way. Just want to make that clear. So, all right, let's dive into it. This week we are talking about biblical sex. And as we were talking about that, I want you to consider this question. What is your ultimate hope for your kids when they leave your home and head out on their own? That's a very important question in general, right? And I think it's one we all think of as parents, like, okay, what are they going to take away once they're gone? But it's also a very important question when it comes to relationships, love, dating, and sexuality. So it's helpful to have some kind of end goal in mind for them. And there's a few ways that we can sometimes get off track with that. So I just want to kind of help focus in on what that end goal could be for us. Proverbs 22 puts it this way. Train up a child in the way he should go. Even when he is old, he will not depart from it. So we want to train up our kids in the way that they should go, so that it takes root and it impacts them for the rest of their lives. I think that's what you as parents hope for. That's what me working with them hopes for. And we all want that for our kids with certain things. So we work really hard on it. So what should our end goal be? If we're to train up a child in the way that he or she should go, what's the end goal? Simply stated, I believe that way is to passionately follow after Jesus. Um, I think one of the best passages of Scripture to help point us to that, it's found in Deuteronomy 6. It's this. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your might. And these words that I command you today shall be on your heart. You shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk of them when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, when you lie down, and when you rise. Shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Our ultimate goal should be to raise up kids who fall in love with God. And just as Moses tells us in Deuteronomy, we're going to have to constantly remind them of this. You guys know this. You're doing it now. You have to instruct them on how to do this over and over and over, right? And you're going to have to also, I think even more importantly, show them what this looks like. And I see you parents doing that. I see you trying to show them how to live this way. I'm encouraged by that. I'm really encouraged by that. And so we have to tell them, but we also have to show them. And then we have to make sure our conversations and guidance on relationships and sexuality are integrated into the ultimate goal of loving the Lord our God with all our heart, with all our soul, with all our strength. So, in order to accomplish that, we ourselves need to have a good understanding of a healthy biblical sexual ethic. So what follows, it's a quick fire course on biblical sexual ethic. Much of what we talk about from here on out, it mirrors the talk we had on sex with our high school students. We're not going to be talking about this with the middle school students. It'll be hinted at in certain ways, but we're not having a full-on out talk about it with the middle schoolers. And a lot of what we talk about will probably be somewhat familiar or known to you, and that's okay. I'm glad about that, but it's helpful to hear what your students are learning, and many of them mentioned that this is their kind of first understanding of this. So it'll be a good refresher for you to know how to kind of navigate this with them at home. So when we talk about having a biblical sexual ethic, it means we need to make sure we're looking to God's purposes and His parameters for sex. So we need to start with this important truth. God created sex, right? When God created Adam and Eve, they had everything they needed for it to happen. And God had some very specific purposes for sex. Dr. Dennis Hollinger, he's the president of Gordon Cronwell Theological Seminary. He has a book that's pretty good out there called The Meaning of Sex. In it, he talks about God's purposes for sex. And he gives kind of 4 that we're going to highlight here. The first is procreation. Sex is the way for us to continue populating the world. In Genesis 1:28, we see God give His first command to the man and woman He created. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground." The second purpose is consummation of marriage. This idea, again, goes all the way back to Adam and Eve. After they were created, we read in Genesis 2. That is why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. So just so we're all on the same page, the whole "they become one flesh," that's talking about sex. The students were shocked to see that this was mentioned so early on in the Bible. So from the beginning and continued through history is the understanding that the wedding ceremony is the commitment to marriage, and the wedding night is the confirmation of the marriage. When explaining this to students, I kind of tell them to think of sex as the exclamation point at the end of the wedding sentence. Okay. The third purpose is to foster love and intimacy. God created sex to be a very intimate act, and it involves a lot of vulnerability. It creates a physical, an emotional, and a spiritual connection in a way that is completely unique. It's meant to be something that brings a couple closer together. And there's actually scientific research that shows that a chemical simultaneously releases in a couple's brain, so both the man and the woman, as they're having intercourse, that creates a unique physiological bond between them. So God truly wired our brains in a way that sex bonds us in a very unique way. And finally, a purpose of sex is pleasure. God could have made it something robotic, just something that has to happen and there's no enjoyment of it, but you do it and babies are born and that's that. But instead, he biologically set this act up to be something that is enjoyable. Now, this is important to make sure you and your kids hear this from the church, okay? That God views sex as good when it's used within his parameters. It's a very good thing. But I'm afraid many of us grew up with the impression that God or the church says sex is bad. And we know that's not true. Yes, it can be misused, and it can be used very, very badly. It can be very bad. But when it's used as it was intended, it's very good. And these purposes that God has for sex kind of help clarify that. A lot of times we focus our talks with our kids on abstinence and not having sex, which is very good advice. We need to tell them that. We need to instill that in them, right? But sometimes our message can be incomplete, and we forget to also talk about how it is a good thing when it's done in the right context. Obviously, I want you to hear me clearly. We want to instill in our children the importance of sexual integrity and purity and abstinence, but we also want to create a healthy view of sex, which is within God's bounds, which purity and abstinence, all that stuff before marriage is clearly within his bounds, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. So it's kind of that shift from not just saying don't have sex to your kids to saying there's a proper time and place for it, and here's all the reasons why and why it's so good when it's within those bounds and why it's so bad when it's not. It just helps create a more complete picture, while also telling them don't have sex till you're married. I joked with the kids last week. They didn't understand. I said, you can't start dating until you're married. And I meant, dating your spouse. And I was just joking, saying, you're all too young to date. Sounding like the old curmudgeon. But I was just joking with them. But, they're, we have to just instill these things in them. We really do. Okay, so those are God's purposes. Let's talk about his parameters, kind of the boundaries that he sets up. So as we think about a biblical sexual ethic, we have to talk about these parameters that God created. And we need to remember and convey to our kids that sex is so powerful and sin itself is so real that we have to be aware of how Satan and our own kind of earthly, fleshly desires apart from God will really try to mess all of this up. So throughout Scripture, God gives some pretty clear instructions and guidelines when it comes to how we should handle sex. Rather than overcomplicating this, we're going to kind of just boil it down to two clear parameters. The first is this: the time and place for sex is marriage. He sets this in motion right away with Adam and Eve in Genesis. So we'll look at that again. That's why a man leaves his father and mother and is united to his wife, and they become one flesh. They are united in marriage, and that's when sex can begin. In the book of Hebrews, Paul says this: marriage should be honored by all, and the marriage bed kept pure, for God will judge the adulterer and all the sexually immoral. These verses and many others paint a pretty clear picture that sexual activity is meant to be between a man and a woman who are married, and sexual activity outside of marriage is considered out of bounds. That phrase, sexual immoral, you see that? The Bible uses it, or a form of it, a lot. And that phrase, it's kind of that all-encompassing phrase for sexual activity that falls outside of marriage. Which leads us to part 2 of God's parameters on sexual activity. It's this: flee from sexual immorality. We asked the question when we were teens, and your kids may someday ask it as well if they haven't already. How far is too far, right? So if sex is meant to be something that happens when you are married, and any sex outside of that is out of bounds, what can we do before we cross that line, right? How close can we get? It's a pretty typical question that young people have. So in response to these questions, I like to point teens to 2 scriptures that present a very different approach. Ephesians 4 verse 5 says this: "But among you there must not be even a hint of sexual immorality, or of any kind of impurity, or of greed, because these are improper for God's holy people." The phrase to lock in on that verse is "not a hint of sexual immorality." Look at this verse from 1 Corinthians 6:18. "Flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a person commits are outside the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body." The phrase here to lock in on is "flee from sexual immorality." So when we consider that question, how far is too far, there's a flaw in that question when you compare it to these 2 verses. At the core of how far is too far is trying to figure out how close we can get to the edge without going over. How close to sinning can I get without actually sinning, right? If our goal is to not have even a hint of sexual immorality, and our challenge is to flee from sexual immorality, I'm not sure we should be asking this question, how far is too far? Instead, I almost feel like the question is, how far away is too far away? Right? Maybe I sound like a Puritan saying that. But the fact is, if we're to flee from it and not have even a hint of it, but we know the reality of temptation, then how far away is too far away? And this is an important thing to talk about with your kids. The way we kind of focused in on it with the youth group is this. This was their big idea for week 3 for Journey High in our talk on sex. It says sex is a big deal to God, so handling sex God's way should be a big deal to us. You see how that kind of connects? Sex is a big deal to God, which leads us into explaining God's creation of sex and his purposes for sex. And then handling it God's way, it ought to be a big deal to us, which leads us into walking through God's parameters. So I do want to recognize something. The whole "how far is too far" question. This is what your teens will say when I kind of ask them that. Hey, that's great. Yeah, how far is too far? Okay, how far away is too far away? Maybe I shouldn't even ask that, this or that. But really, I want to know how far is too far, because I need some practical things here. I know what's kosher and what's not. That's just how their minds work, right? So I gave a few specifics that I gave to your students, and I welcome you to repeat these and share these as you feel comfortable. And this is kind of what I shared. Basically, if the activity has the word sex or the word sex before it or within it, you don't do it. I tell students that don't think that just because it doesn't lead to making babies that it's okay. It's not. It's sexual immorality. Anything to do with sex if it has the word in it. Next, don't touch any body part that can't be legally shown in public. Take it a step further, don't touch anything near those body parts. It's a slippery slope. You don't want to go there. If it has to be covered up in public, then it's off limits. With or without clothes, it doesn't matter. You don't go there. And then one that is an increasing problem with teenagers today. I don't expect any of our kids to be navigating this currently, but it's something we need to be aware of in case it comes up. don't send pictures of those body parts that you can't show in public. You don't send pictures of that. You don't ask for them. You don't send them. And then what I focused on with our kids was this. If someone asks you for those pictures, I recommend running away from that relationship. It's unhealthy. And if you're asking for those, it's time to stop. You don't need to see them. You don't need to send them. That's not good. And there's a lot you can read about the pressures kids are dealing with around that. This is one of the dangers of Snapchat, especially. And so it's just something we need to be aware of and address. And then watch what you talk or tease about. So whether it's with your boyfriend or girlfriend or students flirting with another guy or girl, I tell students to guard against where their conversations and their physical desires and activity go. The things we talk about mold what we believe, and what we believe shapes our actions. So it starts with the mind and guarding ourselves from what we talk about. Then a few questions that I've heard come up in different arenas are these. But what about if we're in love? I say that's great. If you're truly in love, then get married and you can have sex. Obviously, not at too young of an age, and you have to make sure you're truly in actual love and grow and have a healthy, God-centered relationship, all that stuff. With our students, that's not so much an issue. More when I was working in college ministry, that I had to navigate quite a bit. What if we're in love? Okay, then get married, because that's where the appropriate boundaries for sex lie. What if, the question I've heard before, what if we're married in our hearts? I say to that, that's not an actual thing. Get actually married. Marriage, it's an agreement between two people and God in a crowd of witnesses who vow themselves to support you in that marriage, to where you are being united to each other for the rest of your life. That highly important vow and agreement. And then there's the question, what if we plan on getting married someday? Not with our students, more probably with college students. Then you probably should move that wedding date up. If it's too hard for you to wait, then move that wedding day up so that it can be within God's boundaries. Because the promise of the vow is not the vow itself. It's kind of like, someday I will go on a diet, but today I'm going to eat these ribs, and they're really good, and it won't, hurt me later. Well, it actually will. It will. That might not be a good analogy, but we'll roll with it. So, as far as what's okay, I generally pass on this simple advice. I shared this with them last night. I once heard a pastor say this to a bunch of students asking these exact questions. How far is too far? He looked at them and he said, you can hold hands, you can hug, you can kiss. Anything else, you are playing with fire. I think that's absolutely true. I want to acknowledge that this is probably the most teachy and preachy I've been in this series. So I apologize if it comes off that way. But it's really my prayer that you have this biblical framework that helps point to that ultimate goal of raising kids who will love and follow Jesus. I shared these things with the students, and afterward they the most resounding kind of takeaway they had was that was really helpful having clear ideas of boundaries, because we didn't know that. We had some idea, but it's kind of muddy. And when I read the Bible, it's muddy. And when I think about it, I don't know what to make sense of it. So for them, it was very clarifying. I wanted to share this with you so you know how to talk with them about it from your parenting perspective and your values, how you can unfold this within that. We also talked about the importance of, if you're entering a relationship, and the last week with students is all about dating, so we'll talk about this, is talking about those boundaries and expectations early on, so that there's clarity within a relationship, so that you can hold each other to that, and you know where each other's at. We also just hinted at the reality that there are those where they didn't have a choice and something may have been forced upon them, and that is never okay, and it's not their fault. That when those things happen, it's not their fault, and that God's grace extends to you, and He loves you, and He cares for you. He wants to heal you and bring you to restoration. We talked about that if there are those that have stepped outside these parameters and these bounds, and they're feeling convicted, that there's nothing you can do to outrun God's love. And it's not about what you did, it's now about what you choose to do today going forward. To say, okay, maybe you messed up a bit. The reality is today you can decide that from here on out, this is how I choose to live. Again, I don't know exactly where our students are at on that, but I needed to name it just in case, because we don't know. So we talked about some of those things too. So I hope this has brought some clarity. I hope this was helpful. I hope it wasn't just stuff you've already heard or already know, or I hope, I just hope this is a helpful tool for your parenting toolbox as you navigate this with your kids. The goal for us is to have students that have sexual integrity in every area. And if we recognize how important sex is to God, then we'll seek to handle sex and our sexuality in the way that God desires. So that's kind of my prayer, that together we can push our kids towards the sexual integrity. The next series will be the next talk will be the last one for parents. It's all about the talk, or really the conversation, how to navigate these things with your kids. So as always, talk to me if you have any questions, any concerns. If anything I say in these videos doesn't quite resonate right with you, I welcome feedback and conversation with you. I realize videos are kind of one-way communication and they're limiting in that way. So please talk to me. I'm here to support you and talk with you and bring as much clarity as I can. Thanks. Have a great day.